Okay, good afternoon, and welcome back to the afternoon session of the Select Committee on Deliberate Online Falsehoods, Causes, Consequence, and Countermeasures. May I now invite the next witness to come forward to the witness table. Professor Cherian George, yes. Good afternoon. For the record, please state your name and the position you hold in your organization.
Cherian George, Hong Kong Baptist University professor. I'm here in my personal capacity.
The evidence which you will be giving today before the committee will be taken on oath. If you so desire, you can take an affirmation. The clerk will now administer the oath.
Please rise. Raise your right and read out the affirmation.
I, Cherian George, do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence which I shall give before this committee shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Professor Cherian George, please be seated. Welcome to the public hearing of the Select Committee on Deliberate Online Falsehoods. The focus of today's evidence gathering session is for us to put questions to you. You have taken a solemn obligation to answer our questions truthfully. I will now call on Dr. Janil Puttachary to begin.
Thank you, Chairman. Professor George, thank you for your written submission as well as coming before the committee today. What I propose to do is to perhaps go through and summarize some of the various positions that we have arrived at or we have been presented with as a committee. And then we will go through your submission in some detail, if you don't mind, and give you some opportunity to clarify on some of the things that you've put in your written submission. And then we'll have a larger discussion about some of the issues that arise from that. So some of the written representations as well as the oral submissions from a variety of people speak to national security as it is affected by deliberate online falsehoods. And we have a table, I think it's table 1, if we could bring it up. And so a variety of people have taken positions that information warfare threatens our national security, our sovereignty, that this is now becoming an established part of statecraft, a military arsenal, as important as conventional kinetic warfare. So the prevalence of disinformation campaigns as a means of state-to-state action is becoming significant. Several people have taken the position that it's persistent and permanent, and this is not something that is present only at times of overt conflict, that even in the absence of an open conflict, it's persistent, it's permanent, and in fact almost necessary for it to become effective during a time of conflict. It has become quite an attractive option because the costs and manpower needed for this type of disinformation campaign, this online campaign, are disproportionately low. Low cost, low barrier, high impact, high returns. And that these types of tactics are highly effective, and when used as part of that statecraft arsenal, significantly reduce the need to deploy military hard power, so making it even more attractive, the use of a misinformation campaign. And for the purposes of ongoing state-to-state relations, they carry a significantly lower risk of detection. And some people have argued that potentially almost impossible to detect some of these campaigns, because they can reside in our systems long before we can detect it, and they can be conducted at a fairly low level of intensity. Further, that civilians and domestic proxies, this is now page 8, in the target country may be manipulated and used by state actors to deflect blame. And we would assume that any large country would have started developing their own capabilities, that this becomes a requirement for being an effective international player. There are a number of states that have openly declared that these capabilities are part of their arsenal. But we can make the assumption, moving on to page 11, that these are also attractive options for smaller countries, especially given the relationship between cost and what it does for your asymmetry of conventional warfare. Outside of state entities, there's a proliferation of commercial entities who also offer their expertise in this space to the highest bidder. Smear campaigns, hacking, spoofing web pages, mass emails. And these campaigns have serious real-world consequences. The ability to influence events in real time. Aiming to weaken societies, destabilize target societies, reducing our will to fight, sowing discord, destroying trust between communities, both exploiting existing fractures and tensions and potentially creating new sources of polarization. And these fractures and tensions are things that are in the community, between the community and key government institutions, police, religious institutions. And Singapore, we have to assume, is as vulnerable as any state, given our multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-religious makeup and our history, potentially more vulnerable to some of these tactics. And it would be an error to assume that these attempts are not already happening here. And that these are linked to some of our regional security issues. So, attractive target, likely vulnerable, the means and tools are available, and we should assume that various people who have strategic and security interests in our area and in our country are already active in this space. That's with the national security frame. If we look then particularly at the issue of deliberate online falsehoods, this is table 2. The issue at hand is the extent of the impact. What is it? What are the factors that drive the impact of deliberate online falsehoods? We've talked about some of these things in our national security perspective. I won't repeat them. But the ability for these campaigns to erode trust on an ongoing basis. Sort of people have talked about the drip feed approach, trust in police being eroded, and how there's a relationship between these low-intensity messaging and reinforced by a high-visibility crisis, removing trust even further, and you have a vicious spiral, a vicious circle of interactions between the two. This spread of misinformation corrodes our democracy. Healthy public debate is affected, I think a point that you've alluded to in your submission as well. And the prevalence of these deliberate online falsehoods makes it more difficult to discuss key social-political issues. So difficult to discuss. And on top of that, that they entrench existing polarized views. Difficult to have a healthy debate, and difficult for people to engage in views other than those that confirm their own worldview. And so increasingly people will be pushed to the extremes of worldviews as they engage in this space. And some of this is biological. It's structural in the way we as human beings process information and the heuristics around these issues. This is table 3. That we use mental shortcuts to process information. There's an information overload, humanly impossible to verify every single piece of information. And we are biologically wired to have a significant number of biases. That we look for information that confirms our worldview. We accept information from particular sources or information that reinforces our worldview without too much critical thought. And we have a tendency to reject things that would would contradict our worldview. We have motivated reasoning. We go out trying to justify our worldview. And there is the illusory truth effect. As a result, there's a bias towards negativity in the online space where deliberate online falsehoods evoke strong negative emotions. There's a conformity cascade where this has a sort of a social aspect where in close-knit groups people agree with their peers so that they don't feel isolated. And we have some degree of optimism that we can detect falsehood much higher than the data would suggest we're capable of. All of which means that the truth is relatively weak compared to the falsehoods. It does not travel as far, it does not reach as many people, and it is less likely to be appreciated by the people who read it. So Professor Teo Lian, in her testimony, in her discussion, suggested that this would result in an undermining of the marketplace of ideas. This is page 46 of her transcript on the 23rd of March. Not sure if you can see that there. We may be able to blow it up. The marketplace of ideas is undermined by deliberate falsehoods. And she goes on to say in the same sitting, page 51, line 5, there is no rational reason for bringing deliberate online falsehoods under the rubric of protected speech. So, largely, the submissions, the various witnesses that have come here, the discussions that we've had, agree that this is a significant problem, potentially affecting national security, likely affecting our social cohesion and the fabric of our society, likely to not be easily solved, certainly not by any single intervention or single approach. This will be a layered, multi-step, multi-year type of intervention. And fundamentally, that the status quo should not be accepted. We have to find something that we can do with this. So you have, in your submission, suggested a number of possible interventions. These are in paragraphs 33 to 43. Quite a wide-ranging series of ideas. Some are sense-making, things like an early warning system, hate watch group, you've called it, sense-checking NGOs. Some of them are reactive in terms of building up a space of knowledge, so fact-checking NGOs and PR and marketing self-regulation so that an increasing amount of truth is put out there, media and information literacy, inoculation through political literacy, social science research, and some of it is actually intervening. You talked about training for journalists and moderators, working with the internet intermediaries, and also a change to some of our legislative tools you've suggested. So a scope between prior to the falsehood being developed, public education, things to do once you accept that falsehoods are going to be out there, how do you engage in that space, and then how do you then react perhaps and deal with something after the fact. So you've got a number of suggestions, 10 possible suggestions there, and I think the reason you've come up with those 10 possible suggestions is you fundamentally agree with the framing of the scale and the scope of the problem as I've laid out and many other people agree with. So perhaps you want to have some comments about these 10 suggestions that you've made.
Thank you, Minister, for that bringing me up to speed on the discussion so far. I know there have been many days, and I appreciate you summarizing it for me. I should start, though, by confessing that I am not at all an expert in state-to-state security issues. And I appreciate that you have brought on board experts in that, and I've learned from the little that I've seen of what they said. My own comments have been dealing mainly with sub-state actors, if you could put it that way.
But if I may interrupt you, Professor George, you would find their views reasonable?
I do not have an educated basis on which to judge whether they are reasonable or not. They make sense to me, but that is not to say that people who are more expert in those fields would find them credible. I certainly do agree that we have learned the hard way that simple ideas used by political actors activate tribal identities in a way that is very difficult to fight. Yeah? And this is something that we have seen around the world. Many of those simple ideas, which I deal purely with hate propaganda, do include some falsehood, some disinformation, and that is my interest in this topic. Thank you for highlighting the range of suggestions that I have offered. I would say that these lean towards more upstream interventions, if you will, to try to build up a culture that is more resilient to disinformation, but also some, as you put it, reactive interventions. What do we do when disinformation is already in our midst?
Thank you. Now, when we look at the range of possible interventions, one of the things that comes up, of course, is legislative change, a new law, a new set of regulations. But really what you would agree with is that's not the only possible response. You're arguing for a multifaceted approach and also for a judicious and carefully calibrated approach. That whatever it is we do needs to have multiple components, multiple interlocking pieces that perhaps can reinforce and feed off each other.
Yes, absolutely. I think law does have a place. Whether legislative change is needed, it is possible, maybe even likely that legislative change is needed. I would say that it would need to be balanced, as you say, with other non-legal interventions. In fact, my fear is that those non-legal interventions may be the potential effectiveness of those non-legal interventions may be underestimated.
Sure. We'll come to that in a second, but with this issue of a multifaceted, judicious, carefully calibrated approach, which I think is the sense that I'm getting from what you've said so far and most of your submission, I just want to draw your attention to your paragraph 6 and make sure we are on the same page as to why you phrased paragraph 6 in the way that you have. I'm not sure if we can bring it up. Now, in paragraph 6, you're talking about hate propaganda, and it's in the context of an instrument of identity politics. So your last sentence states, even if they do not culminate in violence, such tactics worsen social division and discrimination, undermining national cohesion. You're taking this from, and you've got the reference at the bottom. So you've said this in the context of what hate propaganda can do and the various sort of nuanced, extremist views versus perhaps low-intensity views. But you're establishing, I think, in your paragraph that regardless of the intensity of the propaganda or the type of misinformation that's out there, it will have a corrosive effect. And I just want to understand, reading these couple of paragraphs on its own, one could think that you are advocating a zero-tolerance approach. But I think your position is a bit more of a nuanced, multifaceted approach. Am I right to say that?
Perhaps I would put it this way, that we should have zero tolerance towards human rights abuses such as discrimination against minorities and so on. But that's not to say that our response shouldn't be nuanced. I think they both can be true, right? I suppose I'm guided by what some policy analysts point out, that an optimum response isn't necessarily a maximal response. Yeah?
Indeed.
That there's always the risk of overkill, for example. If we declare that we are going to have a war against discrimination, it is quite possible that the cure may be worse than the disease, to put it that way. So yes, I feel that we should take these risks extremely seriously. But precisely because they are such serious risks, we should be extremely smart in the way that we respond. The particular paragraph that you highlighted, I guess is motivated by the concern that I have that many countries, maybe less so Singapore, start getting concerned about issues like discrimination when it leads to violence, terrorism, and so on. Yeah? So, for example, Indonesia, which by and large has taken domestic terrorism quite seriously, but has taken threats that fall short of terrorism less seriously. And I would argue that around the world that is often the case, that you find minorities living in fear, the state not stepping in, because the state as well as other state actors are not so concerned because it hasn't heightened to a terrorist threat. And I'm signaling that we need to, as a civilized society, we need to be concerned about discrimination, we need to be concerned about threats to peaceful coexistence, even if it doesn't manifest in outright violence and riots and terrorism.
So given the range and different types of levels of impact that deliberate online falsehoods could have, you're suggesting, of course, that we should take it all very seriously, but we should perhaps scale and nuance our response depending on what type of impact or intent is behind the deliberate online
Absolutely.
falsehood. And this, I think, is reinforced in your paragraphs 9 and 10, where you suggest the menu of interventions should include legal prohibition of incitement of material harms, but also counter-speech against bigotry, civic and media literacy education, and support for people sector efforts promoting inclusivity and tolerance. That's in your paragraph 9. And then you go into paragraph 10, and this is a line that you've taken, I think, from work by someone, Jeremy Holdren, you've given a reference there. The reason why incitement to hatred cannot be left to the free marketplace of ideas is that such expression threatens the targeted group's equal rights. Being outnumbered or suffering from historical disadvantages, they are unable to defend themselves adequately in a free-for-all debate. So a range of issues and a range of responses. So a recourse to the law then needs to be part of a much broader response to deliberate online falsehoods. But a number of people, Professor Goh Han, Professor Tioli, and others, have suggested that the legal framework that we have today has significant gaps. So Professor Goh Han suggests that while there are selected criminal and judicial and executive levers today, when he has and others have tested these against real-world situations, they run up against significant limitations. And the limitations that they are worried about are those of scope, speed, as well as adaptability. SPH has similarly expressed concerns about existing laws, as has Dr. Carol Sun, especially Dr. Sun with respect to the rapidly changing environment that we're operating in. Some of the representations have been about who the law applies to. So Mothership, in their transcript of 23rd of March, this is the tab 9, from our own perspective as an online site, we are already regulated under the class license. And later on they go on to say, so we can see that there is a need for an update as well to manage certain challenges on that area, referring to other parties and other players. So, and Jeff Paynes and several others have made a similar comment about why they believe that there are gaps in the legislation. So some of the people talking about gaps in legislation are worried about the legislation in its applicability, scope, scale, speed, adaptability, and some are worried about the legislation as in who it pertains to, the different new actors that are now on this particular stage that we're worried about. Speed comes up as a regular concern when it comes to our legislative landscape. And Dr. Carol Sun says it needs to be fast, and we can see how other stakeholders, perhaps mainstream media, can also play a part in trying to reach out and push out the corrections as quickly as possible. Professor Goh Han, the second important characteristic is that deliberate online falsehoods are rapidly and easily spread. Dr. Sashi Jayakumar, talking from a national security sort of framework largely, and you probably need a kind of legal framework to make clear that whatever you have in the physical world, whatever is outlawed in the physical world is outlawed in the online space, and also to target the specific threats and reduce the virality and speed, and if necessary, take down obvious falsehoods. And then SPH and CNA together have agreed that the outcome or the output needs to deal with the speed of spread of the deliberate online falsehoods, that any process that is not able to deal with things that spread in minutes to hours is not going to be effective in this space. And so Professor Goh Han's gone on to say that even if there are changes to the law, or the law is used to respond in this space, there can be a graduated or a nuanced approach. One end, you might have, for example, a requirement for clarification, but without a takedown of the offending deliberate online falsehood. In some situations, a takedown would be necessary because the material is offensive and likely to be inflammatory. But if we did that, you would need some process for a party to challenge that decision. There would need to be some opportunity for redress. The process needs to be considered because the takedown, in order to deal with speed, needs to be easy and speedy. But you must then have an opportunity to redress that in case an error is made, and you want to reinstate the deliberate online falsehood. And then there is also a component with respect to legislation around demonetization. A significant number of the witnesses have talked about how the financial incentives, the business model and the structure of the various players that we're dealing with here actually drive some of this behavior. And while we cannot escape from that completely, and we may not want to, when it leads to egregious behavior which threatens national security, race, religion, our stability, then perhaps we need to consider what are the financial incentives that are driving this, and we need tools and levers in order to deal with that, and hence some legislative framework to allow demonetization of the process when it is egregious may be necessary. So, and even Mr. Milner, Stephen Milner from Facebook, this is his testimony on the 22nd of March, page 166, lines 24 onwards. Minister Shanmugam said, "I'm talking about something slightly different, DOFs and demonetizing sites that thrive on DOFs." And Mr. Milner replied, "Often these issues are the same. The issues you have are often associated with very clickbaity sites, and we are taking steps to prevent them from advertising on Facebook, and if they can't advertise, they have got no business model." So within their framework, they feel that demonetization is necessary, but of course not all deliberate online falsehoods happens within their platform, and we may need to think of taking that approach and extending it out to other platforms. Mr. Patrick Daniel from the Singapore Press Club, in his testimony on the 23rd of March, there should be a range of remedies, everything from corrections and apologies, right of a reply, takedowns, and of course penalties if it is ascertained that it is deliberate intentional falsehood. So, taking all that together, and you may not be comfortable commenting on all of it, if specific experts have provided their opinions, but I hope you'll accept that there will be some situations where intervention of some sort becomes necessary, even on the backbone, the necessary foundations of literacy, engagement, public education, and awareness that we've talked about. At one extreme, there will be situations where interventions will be necessary. That may require legal powers to do so.
Yes, certainly the law is one serious option. In fact, in cases of incitement, I think some would call it, some have referred to the law as maybe the last resort. I would go further. I would say that, if today a politician or preacher stands up and says, our country has no room for this other community, I don't think that's the time to distribute media literacy leaflets, throw the book at him. Yeah? So the law is sometimes the first resort when it comes to clear cases of incitement. Having said that, I certainly agree with those who have expressed the need for caution and care in formulating and implementing the law. I'd like to highlight maybe a few key principles that I hope will be followed. First of all, any policy must acknowledge unintended consequences. Secondly, the policy must avoid overbreadth, such that the law does not trap what would be legitimate speech in its attempt to catch illegitimate speech. Thirdly, and I think this has not been focused on enough, to acknowledge that the law, no matter how well written, may have limited impact because of the threat of backfire. Yeah? And I'm happy to elaborate on why this backfire effect is so important to deal with, especially when talking about hate propaganda. But yes, I do agree that the committee and Parliament do need to consider whether new laws are necessary. I think it may be useful to distinguish between two different kinds of lawmaking when it concerns regulating speech. The first is, of course, the need to update your law in view of changes to technology, for example. Yeah? When the modalities change, the law needs to adapt accordingly, as we have been doing so for decades. The second, though, is changing the law to make certain classes of speech illegal that were not previously illegal. I think this is far more problematic and far more risky. Yeah? My understanding is that most of the regulatory or legal innovations that have been going on in recent months and years as a result of problems like online disinformation have been in the former category. My German colleagues, for example, tell me that the Net Enforcement Act does not create a new offense of so-called fake news, even though that's how the media often report it. It is really about catching up with the problem that types of speech that are already illegal in Germany are sort of flowing through the net, and the Germans feel the need to tighten that net. Similarly, in Indonesia, there have been recent crackdowns on hate groups, again using the Electronic and Information Transactions Act, I believe. And I'm told that these do not, in fact, create a new offense of so-called fake news. In fact, it is using this law to catch group defamation, which is already illegal under Indonesian law. So just to make that simple point, that I think we are on safer ground if we update our laws to keep up with changing modalities. It is a riskier gambit if we are creating new classes of illegal speech. In general, I think the more prudent, parsimonious, and minimally invasive new laws are, the safer we are as a society. But if I could elaborate as to why I think the backfire effects have been perhaps underestimated. We often think that if we can throw the book at offenders, that is the end of the story.
Yeah.
But usually it is not. And it is important, precisely because this threat is so serious, to think 2-3 steps ahead.
Indeed. That's actually the point I was going to come to, which is how the laws might work in concert with other measures to minimize the unintended consequences of legislative change or
Right.
regulatory approach. If I could perhaps take you on a bit of a tangent so that we can maybe think of how we might frame the matter. If I could reference your para 29, you make comments about what essentially we have perhaps gotten right or done well with respect to race and religion here in Singapore, and especially the way that race has been substantially removed from the divisive electoral tactics that we do often see in other parts of the world. And
religion more than race.
And
I think.
religion, yes. But it's the tactics more than the factor that I'm talking about. And I would suggest that this is not as a result of any single policy or any single option or change that we've made. It's a combination of the fact that we have the GRC system ensuring minority representation. We have a significant effort made around education with respect to the role of race and religion in our social fabric, our national identity, and the potential fault lines going forward. It's an interrelationship with our social policies, whether it's how we live together, how we go to school together, how we look at cultural products and fund these and support these. The ethnic integration policy, which is ensured that there are no ghettos or equivalents of the banlieue in Paris. We have very significant social efforts by volunteers, by civil society organizations working around race and religion and the grassroots, as well as the religious community. And we also have some strict laws on hate speech, on speech which denigrates another race or another religion. And we have these 7 or 8 different factors, multifaceted, iterative over a number of years, interlocking strategies, and the outcomes are the correct outcomes. that what you reference in your para 29 is an outcome as a result of a wide range of interlocking strategies, efforts, and laws. And that these are appreciated not just by yourself, but also by a variety of people. We have got testimony from Dr. Roland Chia from the National Council of Churches. Situation we found ourselves in, the harmony that we currently enjoy is made possible by the contribution of different sectors in society, by the government through certain policies, but also by the different members of the faith communities realizing the fact that we are living in a multi-religious society, and therefore we have to work together to build the nation. And we've got a number of comments about this. When we talk to Mr. Achap, the Archbishop's office, Oh, I'm sorry, we haven't got it on the screen, I beg your pardon. This would be tab 19, transcript for the 14th of March, page 158, if we can put that up there. And Minister Shanmugam says, let me explain, when the state says you can't do something, you know that we have a strong legal framework that all of you support. For example, we have the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, which I think must be a unique piece of legislation, but you know what it does. My understanding is that all of you, and this was a panel from a variety of religious leaders, my understanding is that all of you are strongly supportive of it. And the answer was yes. And Mr. Shanmugam goes on to elaborate this point, which is the combination made by the two previous points, that we have the social efforts as well as the policies. We have a framework of legislation, including the Sedition Act and other various pieces of legislation. But as I said earlier, legislation can only say what you cannot do. It cannot create harmony by itself. I think for that you need a strong set of social policies. You need integration, you need the community to come together, the religious leadership to come together, and you need the government to work with the religious leadership and the community leaders so that we constantly emphasize the importance of integration, working together, respecting each other's faith, the freedom to practice, and at the same time accepting and celebrating diversities. And then he goes on to say, would you say all of these factors put together is why we have the very enviable situation we have in Singapore now? And again, we generally have significant consent. And in the same conversation, this is now tab 21, page 65, line 9, Minister Shanmugam makes the point, there is nothing given about it. It is the result of a lot of effort and a delicate mix, a mix that can be easily undone. Would you agree? And again, significant support for that point of view. So we have an outcome that we are very enviable of today. And if we look back, we can see that we have a multifaceted, iterative approach, interlocking social policies, community efforts, as well as a legislative effort, which took a long time to get us to where we are today. But the result is that we're diverse, we're harmonious, and we are loath to lose what we have today. I'm sure you would agree with all of that. And this is a position that you would strongly support. So if we take that same conceptual framework now and turn it to this new area of deliberate online falsehoods, in reality, why do you need so many different interlocking strategies? It's because for some strategies, there are going to be downsides. For example, whether it's the backfire effect or some other unintended consequences. And so you need that relationship between a variety of tools and levers and interventions so that they play off each other, reinforcing the positive effects and minimizing the negative effects. I'm sure that's a conceptual framework that you would strongly support and
of course,
very much what you're in agreement with, right? If I could turn to your para 37, which is one of the suggestions that you make to repeal the insult laws. And the argument that you are making is that racial and religious feelings, the idea of racial and religious insult, and then by extension, intolerance and hate can be weaponized. I think that's the term that you've used. And I think your suggestion is that the weaponization is possible as a result of the presence of these laws. That's my understanding of your position, right? But that weaponization has not occurred in Singapore to date, despite the fact that we have these laws. But your contention is that in other jurisdictions with those laws, that weaponization has happened? Is that?
yes,
Yes.
that's right.
But I'm sure you'd agree that in other jurisdictions, in the absence of such laws, race and religion have been weaponized for all kinds of purposes, including political. So the presence of the law doesn't automatically mean that it will be weaponized, and the absence doesn't automatically mean it can't be weaponized. Would you agree with that hypothesis?
Okay, let me address. You've raised a number of points, and I understand that, of course, this point is probably the most controversial point in my entire 8 pages of written testimony. So if I could walk you through my thinking on that. First of all, I should state that I understand that it is, in fact, so controversial that I don't expect you to follow it. But I feel it would be remiss of me not to register what I think is an emerging consensus, not in the West, but really in other countries that have this law, that this is a law that needs to be repealed. Yeah? In fact, just a few days ago, on Saturday, the National Law University in Delhi released its report after several years of studying hate speech legislation in India. And one of its many conclusions is that the section of the Penal Code that deals with deals with the wounding of racial or religious feelings needs to be relooked, needs to be revised. Yeah? And this is especially significant because, of course, our own Section 298 is copied and pasted directly from the Indian Penal Code. And they're not the only ones. If you look at equivalent insult laws in Indonesia, which would be blasphemy, the 2 leading institutes that study the growing religious intolerance in Indonesia would be the Center for the Study of Religion and Democracy, or PUSAD, at Paramedina University, the Center for Religious and Cross-Cultural Studies at Gajah Mada University. Their researchers as well, for a number of years, have pointed out that the blasphemy law is more of a problem than a solution. Yeah? So, in fact, we are an anomaly, I would say, yeah, in criminalizing the wounding of racial and religious feelings with no ill effects. And my simple question would be, are we prepared to say that we can guarantee that we won't slip into what the rest of the world has encountered, which is the weaponization of these laws? I mean, you raised the point that we have, by and large, racial and religious relations that other countries would envy. Yeah? But again, I would suggest that we shouldn't rest on our laurels and assume that the formulas that have worked in the past would work in the future. My fear really is that we may be underestimating what we're up against. Yeah? Because if you look at hate groups elsewhere in the region and elsewhere in the world, they are far more formidable than anything that we have needed to deal with. I liken this to the fact that our school teachers and principals, say, are probably not the best experts in the world in dealing with school shooting scenarios. And that's a problem of success, so to speak. They don't need to be experts at dealing with school shootings because we don't have them. You would instead need to go to the US and speak to teachers and principals there about how to handle school shootings. And I fear that when dealing with hate propaganda, for the best of reasons, it's a problem for success. We are, in fact, our policy thinking, in fact, is not as sharp as it should be. Because we have not had to deal with the kinds of threats that most of our neighbors face. Yeah? So that would be my starting point. The truth is that I do see possibilities of these more serious hate propaganda efforts that would come from a number of scenarios that so far we have been unfamiliar with. And it is for this reason that I think we need to look at the best thinking outside of Singapore among policymakers and experts that have been dealing with this for years. And I would say the consensus is that while you must have and vigorously implement and enforce incitement laws, laws that prohibit the wounding of feelings or offense or blasphemy, by and large, are a bad idea. They tend to backfire. They tend to be used by the most intolerant groups to point fingers at moderates, at people of different religions and so on, whom they accuse of insulting their feelings. For example, an intolerant Sunni majority can point to a Shia minority or to the Ahmadiyya sect and claim that these people are wounding their feelings. We have not encountered such problems before, right? But who is to say that the kinds of religious politics and racial politics that our neighbors face and are will not seep here. In the context of, for example, the growing tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, it would be reckless, I think, to assume that that kind of tension will not affect us. And there are more. There are problems of can we guarantee that China will not play up the feelings of Chinese, will not exploit the fact that Chinese minorities are there in Malaysia and Indonesia. Are we confident that that won't seep into Singapore?
But if I could perhaps crystallize a little bit, you are suggesting that we need to reconsider this about a potential problem that may arise from the perspective of other countries that have already seen the problem.
Exactly.
But they have seen this weaponization or potential weaponization of an issue that we have not seen.
Exactly.
No, I understand that perspective. But do you think that the framework that I put out just now was also a perspective that you could potentially agree with, which is that the absence of these laws does not prevent someone weaponizing these issues?
The absence of those laws does not, you're right that the absence of those laws does not prevent the weaponization of insult, but it tends to be much less damaging, much more serious when they don't have the law on their side. So this tactic of deliberately taking offense is a global phenomenon.
No, I understand.
It is deadliest when those same intolerant groups can not only point to their political enemies and say, your teachings, your place of worship, your books, etc., offend me. In addition to that, they can demand that the state take action because the law state in black and white that the state will run to your rescue if your feelings are hurt.
So the way in which the state carries out its calibrated response is an equally important component of this consideration, is it not?
Yes.
So that if this is going to work well, we need to, on the one hand, scope the issues for the threshold for intervention, as well as the way in which the state intervenes, and that you do need that opportunity to calibrate it correctly.
Caution that it would be too optimistic to put our faith in that, because I mentioned earlier that we need to think several steps ahead. States with the best of intentions will find that when they try to use these laws responsibly with restraint and so on, that itself is used as political ammunition. So typically what happens is that a group will claim that another group or book and so on is intolerable offense. They will multiple police reports will ensue. The state or the courts, rightly conclude that in fact there was no serious offense. The group then points the finger at the state and says, "Aha, our followers can now see that the state is not on our side." So really the only way to avoid that kind of over-politicization is for the state to draw the line that I suggest, that of course you take action when there's incitement, but unfortunately when it comes to insult, don't go there, right? Don't attempt to, how should I put it? Don't make the mistake of policing people's feelings, because this can be, we're assuming that people will use it in good faith. The truth is, around the world, people are not using that law in good faith.
But Professor George, have you not yourself argued that part of the reason for this is for states leaving the intervention until too late, when violence and extremism are on the table, and that if states had intervened earlier and put in place many of the ground efforts, the social building efforts, the education efforts, that we have done so in Singapore, that type of over-the-top, escalatory, negatively reinforcing type of response would no longer be necessary?
I don't accept that, for the simple reason that, as you said in when you started, we're dealing with actors who are not necessarily Singaporean, who have not been subject to the education
but Professor, wasn't that your argument, that you are the person. It was your sense that when we talked about the paragraph earlier on, where we talked and you said that you were drawing attention to the fact that states often only respond once there is violence and extremism. And that's your thesis, that actually that they should be encouraged to do something about these issues long before there is violence and extremism. Now this is exactly what we have done here in Singapore, that we are dealing with these problems, race and religion in a historical sense, and we're now thinking about how we will do so for deliberate online falsehoods, and not waiting right up to the point of an incitement to violence and hatred before we do anything, in which case, in order to then regain lost ground, you're absolutely right. We've seen many examples around the world where if you're only doing something at that threshold, you may well have to use a rather inappropriately large response.
Right, let me clarify my answer. What I mean is that at present, the state can count on a number of different instruments, from simply counseling offenders to using the law to education and so on. Much of that is premised on the fact that we're dealing with usually fellow Singaporeans, Singaporeans who have been socialized into the kind of social compact that we have, and we have not needed to deal as a result with the kind of bad actors that in fact are not acting in good faith. So what I was trying to explain is that even though we have a wide range of policies in place that I hope we will strengthen, from education to media literacy through interreligious trust-building processes and so on, we should be aware of the fact that some of the actors that we would encounter in the future, if we're not encountering them already, are not receiving any of this the benefits of any of this education or trust building. Yeah? They are actors with their own agendas, and we may suffer collateral damage as a result of their actions, which are not as tempered and as measured as we normally are able to count on from, say, Singaporean preachers or religious groups and so on.
But Professor George, I'll put it to you, again, with respect to our historical success, and you've repeatedly accepted that we have been very successful in this. Our issues of race and religion with respect to our social cohesion have been around long before there was the internet. And while you rightly point out all these ecosystem of interventions that we can deploy here in Singapore, we can't affect people outside of our borders. But I'm sure you'll agree that our racial and religious harmony has perhaps come under pressure from actors outside of our borders. And nevertheless, we have been successful at maintaining our racial and religious harmony. So we have had that approach pre-internet, pre-deliberate online falsehoods. So why is it that despite our track record of success for something as potentially divisive, explosive, inflammatory, and central to our national identity, using this approach of ecosystems, ground-up initiatives, social policies, together with legislative levers, some of them are particularly strict, we have been successful at managing ourselves, managing the pressures on us from other states and international relations? Why do you not have some idea that we could do this successfully with respect to deliberate online falsehoods going forward? We've heard from many of the people that the technology to apply different thresholds and levers and filters for any of the social platforms with respect to geography is easily doable, that this is not a problem for them. So could we not, in truth, take the approach that we have had around racial and religious harmony and apply it to what is now a new problem of deliberate online falsehoods, which has an interaction, of course, with the issues of race and religion?
Well, in short, the answer is really for the same reason that this select committee has been convened, because we are entering a qualitatively new era, which may require qualitatively different thinking. Yeah? And that's really the spirit in which I have made all my recommendations. As I said at the start, and I was not being facetious, I do not expect this select committee to recommend repealing Section 298. But although I do, in all sincerity, hope that over the long term, the competent authorities, the Academy of Law, the AG's chambers, and so on, will in fact look deeply into whether this law needs to be tweaked. Considering that even the country that we inherited this law from, their experts have been pointing out for years that it does not work. Yeah? But so all I would suggest, within the what is within the framework of the Select Committee is that when you do draw your laws, to try to avoid pegging them to Section 298, because as I mentioned earlier, of course, we would expect legislation to ensure that it keeps up with technological change, etc., and is able to address the public interest in the way that our existing laws do. So I would expect whatever new legislation is planned to, in a sense, be pegged to or to ride on existing offences. And in most cases, those offences, like incitement and so on, do need to be updated for the internet. All I'm counselling is that the new law does not include any section that rides on Section 298 specifically, on the wounding of racial and religious feelings, because the evidence overwhelmingly from around the world is that that causes more problems than it solves.
I understand your position, Professor, but what would you say to the members of the religious community, the religious leadership, who take the very opposite view from what you have just described and who feel that such a tool is necessary to maintain and protect what we already have in Singapore?
It would require, of course, a certain amount of political education, which I think our leaders have the political capital to engage in. It would require explaining to them exactly as you have that, in fact, what protects different religious groups is something far more extensive and far deeper than simply Section 298 or the protection of wounded feelings. It would involve explaining to them the kinds of threats that are being caused elsewhere. It would involve explaining to them that, yes, we have been lucky in the sense that that particular provision may have, in a sense, been used by responsible actors, both on the government side and in response to also fairly responsible actors, on the side of religious groups and so on. But we cannot guarantee that. I mean, it was in fact a law professor who told me something that I understand all good law students learn. It was new to me because I didn't study law, which is that when drafting law, never think about how you would use it. Think about how it would be used by your worst enemy. Yeah? We have, I think, been fortunate not to have to confront that. I'm simply counseling that as we draft new legislation for these new times, think carefully about how any of that legislation might be abused, number one, by a government that is not as responsible as the current government, number two, abused by groups that may not be as temperate, as restrained, as moderate as we tend to deal with in Singapore. If I could just, you did mention also that there is a range of possible interventions from demonetizing the internet to perhaps just requiring clarifications to actual blocking and so on. I would certainly say that...
Professor, not demonetizing the whole internet, right?
Yes, that's right.
Demonetizing the
yes, thank you.
particular...
That's right. That bad behavior shouldn't be rewarded by the market, so to speak. That, to me, I think, is the least debatable. It's just it's a win-win all round, if that can be done. The idea of finding a way to insert a kind of almost like a right of reply, when there is an objectionable propaganda site, for example. If there is a way to insert some kind of advisory, such that before you move on to that offensive site, you are receiving alternative sites that are more authoritative, you are receiving advice from some trusted, honest broker to say that the site that you're about to visit has in fact been identified as a hate site. In principle, this is wonderful, right? I would say that this is not detriment to free speech. It falls in the category of what some behavioral scientists call nudges. They are changing the choice architecture without actual censorship. So in principle, no problem. The question is whether it's technically possible. I wish it is, but I am told by geeks who know the internet a lot better than I do that it is, in fact, much harder than I hoped it would be. Yeah? So there are technical problems there. As far as,
There appears to be some difference of opinion about that.
among the experts?
Yes.
I'm sure, yeah.
Largely driven by who might be their financial incentives.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so I would hope that that is possible. As for takedowns, which do sort of affect free speech more, in some cases it seems very clear-cut, but I would say that even these, there's a risk of backfire. I keep using that term backfire because I've seen worldwide how even quite reasonable takedowns are exploited as further propaganda ammunition. Yeah? And this routinely happens. Yeah? If I could just give you one example of how these groups think several steps ahead. Yeah? This was in response to some change in the algorithm that Google made, I think, last year. Yeah? So one of the most determined hate sites in the US is a site called Jihad Watch. It is out-and-out anti-Muslim propaganda. And it used to concern me 2 or 3 years ago that if you type into Google Islamic terms like jihad, Sharia, and so on to find out more about them, Jihad Watch would appear on the first screen, usually just behind Wikipedia. Yeah? This is alarming. You know, why is Google recommending this site that hate watch groups have identified as an out-and-out extreme hate group? I was very glad to see last year that Google somehow changed its algorithms to reward authoritative sites. So now if you do a Google search on terms like Sharia and jihad and so on, you will instead be served entries from authoritative news sources like BBC, from Encyclopedia Britannica, from legitimate Muslim organizations and so on. You can still find Jihad Watch, but it slips to the 4th or 5th screen. Yeah. So great so far. You know, it looks like a triumph for reason, but again, what is the next step? The next step is, of course, that the people behind Jihad Watch milk this for publicity advantage. Yeah? The owner of Jihad Watch, certain Robert Spencer, launches a counter propaganda offensive with articles designed to agitate his supporters. Yeah? So he, some of the headlines read, and I quote, "Google bows to Muslim pressure, changes search results to conceal criticism of Islam and jihad," unquote. Another article, I quote, "Google's new hate speech algorithm is anti-Semitic and pro-jihad," unquote. Yeah? And this is not unusual. This is normal. You put in a countermeasure, they counter you with propaganda. Because don't forget, they are not limited by decency, truth, or anything good. Yeah? They know no limits. Then you have Fox News, the dutiful servant of these groups, interviewing Robert Spencer and Jihad Watch, and portraying them as victims of the left liberal bias of the media. This was Tucker Carlson, who I believe was on TV in Singapore a few hours ago. And this is not an isolated case. Yeah? I understand from my colleagues in Germany that this has already happened with its new Network Enforcement Act. You have intolerant populist groups claiming dishonestly that their posts are being banned to increase sympathy and distrust in their institutions.
So whatever we do,
extreme groups flagging posts that they do not agree with in order to game the system, to force the platforms to take down moderate posts. That is what we're dealing with.
So we will always have an issue where the adversary will be changing its tactics in response to whatever intervention we put forth.
It's not even changing its tactics. It's part of a playbook. It's part of a playbook.
Exploiting every loophole and every opportunity to get their message.
I wouldn't say, in this case, it's not a loophole. Yeah, of course, that does happen as well.
Yes.
Yeah? You put in technical block, they find a way around it.
Yeah.
This is, in fact, a consistent playbook that applies not just to online laws, it applies to any
No,
kind of restriction that
indeed.
affects their work.
They will find a way.
They use it. What they do is that the moment the government comes after them, they point to it to play the victim and increase support among
But
them.
I'm sure you're not advocating that we should therefore do nothing.
No, but we should do it with open eyes and
Indeed.
recognize that we should not over-depend on law.
But we should do our best to intervene in this space to get the outcome that we need.
And that outcome, by and large, will not be found primarily through law. It needs to be done, but we need a lot more action in the non-legal space.
No, indeed. I think largely no one has, I think, suggested that any legislative change is the be-all and end-all. It's a ecosystem
I'm
of
glad to hear that.
interventions and approaches that we're looking for. Thank you, Professor George.
Oh, thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
I think you can take it that on the last point. I haven't really discussed with my panel members, but I'll be surprised if any of us believes that the law is going to be the complete solution. It cannot be. It has not been in the real world in a variety of issues that we deal with, and I can't see how it can be this complete solution here. I think what's come out very clearly in the evidence is the challenges are very significant. The approaches to deal with those challenges are going to have to be very multifaceted. It has got to include a very substantial amount of media literacy, education, an approach of bringing a much better understanding to the people of the risks and an ability to understand what is true and false, but underpinned with a legal framework that gives the necessary powers to intervene, to keep the framework intact and allow all of these other initiatives to work. But that is the kind of evidence that has been put forward so far. And I would think, it's far too early for panel members to take a view, but those are the kind of views that sound sensible. I mean, if anyone were to say you're going to solve this with some legal solution, it would have been done somewhere else much earlier. Now, I wanted to explore, it's slightly conceptual, the point you made about illegality, what is illegal, updating the laws to keep up with, say, changes in technology and creating new offenses. I wonder if there is another aspect. I mean, one of the most helpful papers that have been put to this select committee was from a couple of people in Germany. And the point they made is, you have the public sphere, public space, public square, whatever you call it, where you discuss issues of public policy, you debate in parliament, you have the media, and you have the private space where people pass remarks to each other, and those are not curated, those are not thought through, those are, may often be highly inaccurate. What has happened with the internet is that you have a merging of the private and public space. What I would say to a friend without much of a thought and which could be completely inaccurate can now be shouted out to 100,000 people, 200,000 people with very different consequences. So the public and private spheres have merged. And to that extent, that makes public discussions, policy making, for example, in Europe, discussions on immigration, extremely difficult. I think they make public policy making and public discussions on many areas very difficult. The question is, or rather the other point is, today with a comment, which I click on to a huge number of people, which is then viraled, I could destroy reputations, I could tarnish people. I mean, you must have come across in your teachings the number of people who have been affected by online mischief targeted at them. In the real world, if you go and hit someone, the law is clear. In the virtual world, you do that, it's not always clear that there is a legal remedy. I wonder what you would say about that gray area. Let's say there is a lacuna. It doesn't come within any of the existing laws. It doesn't come within, say, law of defamation. It doesn't come within, say, the harassment laws, and it doesn't come within the laws of assault. But nevertheless, it falls and it deeply damages somebody else. I mean, you can imagine circumstances. What would you say about that?
Wouldn't it still fit under the first category of updating laws to address harms that have already been recognized as worthy of legal intervention? So, for example, in the same way that the new, now not so new, Anti-Harassment Act,
Now, take it
as
that
I understand it, it did not actually create a new kind of harm that was to be
take it
addressed.
that there can be a lacuna where you know, in the kind of, I think the kind of area that I'm describing about would not be unfamiliar to you. Assume that there could be a lacuna in terms of our current laws for the time being. And I just wanted, I mean, if you can help us, so it'll be helpful, but if you think that that's not an area of expertise, that's fine.
Well,
But I just wanted to understand.
acknowledge that there might be new types of harm that, or rather, harms that were previously not regarded as the
Precisely.
proper focus of the law, that now the state
Because of
does
the
need to take
internet.
an interest in. In principle, of course, yes, that would
Yeah.
be the case.
Well, it's really that it's not so much state takes an interest, but you see people's lives being ruined and affected and damaged by quantity, which then has a qualitative difference in that it's spread to so many people through
Yes.
modern technology.
In principle, yes. of course.
Understand. There is another point that I wanted to understand from you, or rather share with you. It may not be within the remit of this particular select committee to look at Section 298, but there is a Penal Code Review Committee that is looking at a root and branch review of the Penal Code, and we will certainly put your views across to that committee, headed by Menlaw, Ms. Indrani Raja. I will make this philosophical point, though. I think there may not be much of a difference between us in this. See, taking on, or coming back to the point that Minister Janil made, in these areas, yes, there are other countries which are concerned about such laws. Yes, we have seen an abuse of such laws without having to name countries. We have not seen an abuse of that law. The question in my mind is, I've also seen abuse of similar types of principles, even absent such a law, because the government wants to do it, or governments want to do it, or unwilling to stop others from doing it. So the point is, the absence or presence of that law is not the determinative factor. It's going to be what sort of government you have. I think that's going to be the key point, because these areas, race, religion, wounded feelings, and so on, can be impacted quite badly with bad governance, absent or present Section 298. But your point will be, why have it anyway? I mean, assuming that is a given, why have it anyway? One has got to look at Section 298 together with the other sections we have in the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act and the other provisions. Because just as I mentioned to the religious leaders, the framework of laws that surround what can and cannot be said about another race, another religion in Singapore, there are a number of different pieces of legislation that do that. Thankfully, we have come to a position today where we don't invoke them very much. And that's good. We don't need to, we don't have to. But the very fact that we can invoke them, I think, has a salutary effect on a lot of people. and all the other interventions that Dr. Janal talked to you about. Without them, we won't have this situation anyway. So we will look at your views, and I will pass them on to my colleagues at Menlo to see if removing it in some way will weaken that legislative framework, or whether it can be removed without a serious impact on the legislative framework. And I want to put on record that the government doesn't look at the legislation in the context of religious harmony as the first port of call. The first port of call is usually discussions, grouping of the religious leadership, asking them to talk about the right approach to their flock. I mean, you will be aware of the latest sort of discussion centering on what a Christian preacher is alleged to have said about Muslims. I don't know the facts, I don't want to comment on it, there are investigations, but it again shows you how sensitive and serious these things are. And we want to make sure we have the right legal framework. If comments had been made, and if they are hurtful, then we want to be sure that we are in a position to act. So that's not so much a question as much as a discussion. I'm putting that point to you, and we will take back your views.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
If I could just maybe, I'm glad, I appreciate the comments of the Minister. If I could just highlight one point that I believe may have perhaps not been given enough attention, and that has to do with education. There's been a lot of talk about media literacy education, but in my view, I think what is perhaps even more important is political literacy, or what might be called civic education. Because we should, I think, learn from other countries' mistakes here. And it's become, I think, quite obvious that in the US and Western Europe, perhaps because they are established democracies, they may have underestimated the need for ongoing civic education. They dropped the ball, and as a result, the populations of the US, Britain, and elsewhere became more susceptible to intolerant populist disinformation. The kind of civic education that I'm talking about is really the basic principle that democracy is more than just a numbers game. That it in fact also includes equal rights for minorities. It's not that the majority must always win. And I think it's probably no accident that the Western European country that has been most resilient against populist disinformation is the one that, for obvious reasons, has had to invest the most in civic education, which is Germany. So I think that we can do a lot more in educating our public about core political values that need to be entrenched. And these include equal rights, non-discrimination, religious freedom, and I think the basic principle of reciprocity, or what the religions call the golden rule, yeah? That whatever respect and room that one group expects from others and the state must be extended to other groups in equal measure. And it's striking how this basic democratic principle has been forgotten in many established democracies. I think this, if you're talking about long-term intervention, these are the principles that will make Singapore much more resilient against hate propaganda.
When I suggested something like that, there was some unhappiness. But the minister, or one of the education ministers sitting here, I'm sure, has listened very carefully to you. Right. Thank you.
Indeed, Professor George, just before we went for our lunch break, we had representatives from the National Library Board, and we discussed quite a bit about the importance of information literacy, and a point which many other expert witnesses before you also emphasized the importance of that. If there are no further questions, I would like to thank you, Professor Cherian George, for taking the time to participate and to contribute to the Select Committee process. So in a few days, we will send to you a transcript of today's proceedings. Do go through them, and if you have any minor amendments, please make the changes and send the transcripts back to us.
Thank you very much.
Again, thank you. Sergeant at Arms, Please escort Professor George out.